Okay, hello everybody. We'll just get started and I'm sure a couple more people will trickle in. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the third in our KBA webinar series. So if you missed the first couple, that's okay. We'll still give a quick introduction here to what KBAs are. And I will put also a link in the chat box to where you can find the recordings for the last couple of webinars if you're interested in going back and watching those. And so I am Jamie Grimm. I'm part of the KBA team at WCS Canada. And I am very happy to introduce Andrew Couturier today, who will be talking about the relationship between IBAs and KBAs in Canada. And Andrew is the Senior Director of Landscape Science and Conservation with Birds Canada and a key partner in the KBA Canada process. So I will ask, as Andrew goes ahead and gives his presentation, that you can use the chat box function to ask questions throughout, and we'll save those all to the end, and then we can have a question and answer period. At that time, we would prefer if you could use the chat box for all questions, but if there are any issues, I will allow individuals to unmute and ask questions verbally that way. So thank you very much for joining us, and Andrew, you can get started whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you, Jamie, for that warm introduction and welcome. And thank you everyone on the line who is taking time out of their day today to join. So this presentation that I'm about to give was originally a conference presentation from earlier in the summer. And as such, I would like to acknowledge quickly my co-authors from Birds Canada who helped tremendously with the work that you were about to see, Amanda, Dean, and Sandra, and of course the KBA collaborators and partner organizations, including Jamie and others at Wildlife Conservation Society of Canada and NatureServe Canada, especially. These three organizations have been instrumental in getting us this far today in the KBA process. And also a quick acknowledgement to the important funders that are helping us to do this work, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and also the RBC Foundation. So I'm going to start with a couple of take-home messages. Importantly, I would like you to come away from this presentation with the understanding that KBAs are a very good tool, but they are just one tool of many. They do not address every conservation need or situation that we might find ourselves in. Same way that protected areas don't do everything. They address a particular niche. And so KBAs are a very strong tool and we're very excited about them, but they will not apply in all situations. So bear that in mind. Excuse me for a moment. Go. So as you may know, Canada is in the midst right now of identifying our KBAs, what will be KBAs across the country, and offshore too, eventually. Mostly we're focused on terrestrial areas at the moment, but there is an effort to start thinking about pelagic areas as well. Important bird and biodiversity areas. These are the world's most important places for birds. These currently form the backbone of all the KBAs identified so far across the world. And I'll speak more to that, of course, in the coming slides. Lastly, establishing a full network of KBA sites in Canada will take some time. We're really just in the first phase of this work, and there's quite a lot of work to do, as you'll see. With that, I will give a very brief overview of KBAs. What are they? Well, simply put, they are sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity. They're based on rigorous scientific criteria, and you can see this lovable diagram here on the right side of the screen explains some of the criteria, or just lists the criteria at least, of what goes into or what's behind the KBA global standard for identifying KBAs. So you can see there are different types of KBAs that can be identified based on these different types of criteria. And I won't go into the weeds on what they all mean and all of that, because we don't have time. But there is a global standard that you can download from a website. It's easy to find, and if you really desire to learn more about it, we can certainly point you to some resources at the end. An important thing to remember about KBAs is that there's no management prescription associated with a KBA site after it is identified. These are not protected areas. There's no limitation put on private lands where a KBA might be identified. This is simply a scientific process and tool to identify where biodiversity exists on the land and over water. The KBA initiative is a global initiative of the world's largest environmental non-governmental organizations, and there are something like 11 or 12 of them involved, including BirdLife, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Wildlife Conservation Society, NatureServe, WWF, Conservation International, and the list goes on. So it's a big deal bringing all of these major NGOs together to work on a common system. A lot of these partners do have their own systems for prioritizing where conservation investments are to be made. So it's a very big deal to have everybody under the same roof, marching towards the same beat. And speaking of that, so the goal is actually to bring all of biodiversity under one common system. So birds, plants, butterflies, etc. These all do have their own systems for identifying where the most important places are. But here the idea is to really bring everyone together, all taxa together under one common and very rigorous system so that we can work in concert across the whole world. It's an important feature of this. And some of this is a little bit repeated here. So I'll just mention that, I'll just highlight one thing on this slide, is that this project in Canada really has brought together a network of organizations that have never worked together on a project of this magnitude before. Sure, there have been lots of bilateral partnerships between partners, but this is the first time that such a wide consortium of different agencies has come together, really focused on a single task. So it's just the value of that alone, it has been tremendous. And so speaking of that coalition, here's a kind of schematic of the program, starting on the left-hand side with the global KBA program. This is a global program, and it's run from a secretariat based in Cambridge, United Kingdom. There are standards that have been developed, as I said, for identifying KBAs. There's a world database of KBAs that's in development. There's various committees and group structures around all of that. And then stepping down to Canada, what we have done is set up what we're calling the Canadian KBA Coalition. This is a group of some of the organizations that are in-country representatives of the larger NGOs that operate at the global level of the global KBA partnership, and you can see the logos of the organizations here that are chiefly implementing the program. But it really does involve a lot of an even broader constituency of Indigenous organizations and provincial and territorial organizations and governments. It's run by a management committee, and you can see some of the functions here are shown, with the KBA Secretariat for Canada being run by WCS Canada, where Jamie works, and And on the other end here, KBA databases for Canada that are being developed to support the whole network. And there you can see NatureServe Canada and Birds Canada playing a pretty strong role. So I'll just say a few words about my organization. Birds Canada is Canada's leading charity dedicated to bird research, education, and conservation. And you may be familiar with some of the citizen science programs that we run in Canada. Some of these are continental in scale in partnership with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and National Audubon, for example. And then there are a lot of other programs that we run exclusively in Canada, such as breeding bird atlases and marsh monitoring program, and just there's a whole suite of them, and they involve something like 50,000 people every year getting involved in these programs, and they generate tens of millions of bird data records, and that stockpile of data is just growing and growing and growing, and it's really amazing to work with. Birds Canada is also a partner in BirdLife International, and as such, we have been running the Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas program in Canada since about 1996, in partnership nationally with Nature Canada and the help of regional organizations across the country. And of course, this is our segue into the key biodiversity areas where we are transitioning and looking at whether our IBAs will qualify as KBAs and which ones, and I'll tell you a lot more about that next. So yes, Birds Canada's role in KBAs, this is grossly simplified, but you can think of it in these kinds of phases, and right now we're in this identification phase early on, and part of our work is going to be to develop the KBA database and web portal kinds of exploration tools to help dig deeper into the data and present the data to the public. Another item is to develop a story map that will showcase the KBA concept. And I've put a very subtle streamer along the bottom of the screen there to point you to that story map that has just been released yesterday, in fact. So I would encourage you at the end of the presentation to go and check that out. But for the rest of the presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about this so-called IBA to KBA crosswalk and explain a little bit about what we've been doing to determine which IBAs might qualify as KBAs. So IBAs do make a very rich foundation for KBAs across the world. More than 12,000 IBAs have been identified over the last 40 years. And this has been done in 200 countries and territories by the BirdLife Partnership. And as I said, these sites form the backbone of the currently identified KBAs across the world. In Canada, we have roughly 600 of these sites, and you can see the map there. 200 of them or so have some degree of protection, so that leaves a lot of them without protection. 67% of them are monitored by roughly 6,200 people every year. We're able to track that. Some monitoring databases I mentioned, citizen science databases. And we also have an active network of site stewards or caretakers, we call them, that these are people passionate about their local sites, and they take care of them. They do bird monitoring, they do habitat restoration, education, put up signs, etc. So there's an active network of people around these places. The program has been going on for 20 plus years, as I mentioned, and we've invested millions of dollars in conserving these places. We have regional IBA programs operating in provinces with the help of provincial nature federations in many cases. And we've known for years that these IBAs overlap strongly with other biodiversity, right? It's no secret. And we did a quantitative analysis using NatureServe and Conservation Data Center data. And we were really blown away by the results showing us that of the federally listed biodiversity that we know about in Canada, 70% of federally listed amphibians and reptiles are overlap or are captured by the IBA network. For mammals, it's 65%. For vascular plants, it's 58%, and it goes on. So we know that these places are exceptionally important for biodiversity. So a next step, in order to identify KBAs in Canada and look at which IBAs might qualify as KBAs, you need standards to do that. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's a global standard for the identification of these KBAs. But in order to make it more relevant to the Canadian context of conservation, the coalition has developed a national standard, like a kind of a national step down, if you will, from global to the national situation here in Canada. And this document isn't quite publicly available yet, but it won't be too long before it is, and then you'll be welcome to read all about that. But in terms of birds and which criteria we are looking at, you remember the schematic diagram from the beginning. We are looking mainly at two types of criteria for birds at the moment. We could do more in the future, but for now, what we are starting with are two criteria. The first one is threatened biodiversity, and so here we can look at threatened biodiversity in terms of two levels. The first being the global level, according to the red list that is published by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. BirdLife International maintains the bird component of the red list, and so this tells us which birds globally are threatened with extinction. And so we can use that list for identifying sites in Canada. There aren't that many species actually that would meet that. But Canada has its own listing process and it's run under COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And for birds, this is a very mature, well-respected, and up-to-date system. So it's rather easy for us to step down from global to the national level because we have this established body of work that can tell us which birds are threatened nationally. And so we use that. We use those two items to identify sites that are important for threatened biodiversity. Then a second criterion is this so-called biological processes, where you're looking at demographic aggregations. And this just means places where birds congregate or aggregate at certain points of their life cycle. So you could think of situations such as, a seabird colony. Think of the puffin colonies in eastern Atlantic Canada, or gannet, or the gannets in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, places where birds socially aggregate in large numbers to breed. That's one example. Another example, though, is species that could be quite distributed on there and dispersed during the breeding season, but during the winter, let's say on the southern Great Lakes region in Ontario, you might have large congregations of birds, such as these canvasbacks here in the photo, gathering in large numbers in these types of places. Another example is our gulls. Bonaparte's gulls are distributed through the boreal during the breeding season, but they aggregate in very large numbers along the Niagara River, especially near Niagara Falls. So, and there are different ways of calculating that based on the global the global population size of birds, and also their national or biogeographic populations within Canada. And so we can calculate these things in this way to discover which of our IBAs might qualify as KBAs. So moving on then to what we did, getting down into the details a little bit here. As I mentioned, we have all of these bird monitoring data sets at our disposal from eBird and Christmas bird count and atlases, and really it's quite a long list. And so we can harvest that data, associate it with IBAs, and then use it to test against KBA criteria. We also have been doing structured monitoring at our IBAs for at least a decade. And this is a protocol for getting comprehensive types of surveys done at larger IBAs, kind of the same way a Christmas bird count is conducted with sectors and groups counting in Sector 1, Sector 2, and Sector 3, and then adding up the total at the end of the day, kind of thing. So we have these different types of data. We have that structured kind of work. We have scientific studies. We have papers, and these kind of what I would call opportunistic or incidental types of data from eBird, people just going out and birding. They might not even know that they're at an IBA, but because we know where the location was, where they were counting, we can associate that record with an IBA and get a number, and we can compare that to the criteria and find out whether it meets criteria or not. And so all of that data is available the same way it was for our important bird areas, we can use for KBA assessment. Just gonna take a little water break here. So 17 million bird observation records overlap with IBAs and potential KBAs. And we found that 50,000 of those met some kind of KBA threshold, representing some 157 species. So Canada has about 500 species or more. So it's not representing all species, we know that, but it is getting to a good cross-section at least of species and habitats based on the criteria we're using. It's not perfect, but it's a start. And so we've determined that so far, roughly 268 of our 582 IBAs seem to be meeting global criteria for KBAs. And similarly, at the national scale, it's 224 of them that are meeting national scale. And this is all subject to further scrutiny and review, but that's our initial pass at it anyway, so it looks pretty promising. And then there are 100 IBAs that are not meeting KBA criteria for birds that we've tested so far. And so we've looked into this a little bit, and we need to continue to look into it, but it does appear that most of those do not meet current IBA criteria either. So, and we need to dig in a little deeper to figure out some of the reasons and what we're going to do about these 100 sites that aren't meeting the KBA criteria so far. But that's another next step that we need to do. Important to mention, though, is that this is just looking at the birds part of it. There's also a parallel process to look at other biodiversity that's overlapping with these IBA sites. And so these 100 that are not meeting KBA criteria for birds could well be meeting criteria for something else, like could be anything, butterflies, whatever. So they could still become KBAs for something else other than birds. So that all needs to be determined still, though. And so when you look at this on a map, the red dots are the IBAs that do appear to meet some type of KBA criteria, and the blue dots are the 100 sites that do not appear to meet KBA criteria at this time. This map is from July. Things may have changed slightly, but the overall picture is about the same. And so some of the issues we've encountered while doing this are that, well, we have a lot of IBAs that are remote or difficult to access otherwise, and so we don't have frequent monitoring data from them. We might have one record from 30 years ago or something like that. and it may not have been visited even in that time for checking on what's happening with bird populations. So that's an issue that we need to grapple with. But even in the South, sometimes we get situations where we just don't have the repeat frequency of visits that we would otherwise like to have, and that makes it hard to. Both of these things make it challenging to confirm KBA status in many cases, because we do need to be able to prove that the organisms are still there predictably with some regularity and meeting the KBA threshold. So this is again kind of a next step, more work to look at what to do about that. And part of that next step is sending out the results of our IBA to KBA crosswalk that I've just been talking about, sending those out to experts and some of our partners to look at, and to really pore over the data from each IBA to see if it makes sense, and to see if see if there's newer data available, to look for species that might be missing from particular sites that could qualify it as a KBA, also to flag any potential missing sites. Like so far, we're mainly dealing with looking at IBAs that might transition to KBAs, but there could be other places in between that are not in the network of current IBA sites that could qualify as well, and we'd like to know about those. And again, the 100 sites that do not meet IBA criteria, that's part of the consideration of for the review as well. Perhaps there's other data that they know about and can help us fill in the gaps. And then the overlap with other biodiversity question that I mentioned on the previous slide. Perhaps some of these sites will qualify for other species. There's also an additional complication there, because in some cases there could be overlap with other species, but those species might have a different boundary than the boundary that we've drawn for birds based on the IBA. So there's some guidelines around that of what we're supposed to do with combining boundaries into one single site and so on. And it's all very, very complicated and time consuming, and yet another next step for us to work on. So yes, there's no cookbook of how to do this. Canada is one of the first countries in the world to do this, so we're really blazing a trail learning as we go, as we keep saying. Yeah, there's no cookbook to follow, so we're learning as we go. We're trying to develop processes as we go, test things as we go, and build from there. So it makes it a time-consuming, all-involving process. And even this IBA to KBA assessment, which we all kind of thought would be not that complex to do, has turned out to be quite complex and a lot more time-consuming than we initially thought. So an important lesson there. This will be no secret to the Canadians listening to this talk. Canada is a very big place, the second largest country in the world, actually, and is equivalent to some of the what we would call regions of the world. And we also have a sparsely distributed human population on the landscape, so it's difficult to get the kind of monitoring that we might like to have for these important places. And lastly, this is more of an implementation and uptake challenge, I suppose. We have this 20+ year history of the IBA brand. You know, the conservation community is very familiar with IBAs. They're used regularly for environmental assessments. We get lots and lots of data requests from industry because they know that they have to look for other values that are present on the landscape. And so there's just a logical, practical challenge of shifting from that kind of that kind of situation to a broader biodiversity umbrella that KBA brings. Ultimately, I think it's more powerful to have the broader biodiversity umbrella, but it will just take time, and there'll be this period of transition where we're moving that way. And all of this is going to cost a lot of money, and it won't get done quickly. So it's something looming for all of us that, and we're heavily focused on that, is how to fund this into the future. And in case you missed all my subtle reminders about the story map being available, here's a not so subtle plug at the end. This is I think my second last slide. And these are some screen grabs from the story map that will give you a sense of what is in it. It's quite colorful. It has maps. It has really cool information about birds and biodiversity present at a couple of our most impressive candidate KBA sites, Long Point and Fraser River Estuary in Vancouver. And I would encourage you to check that out at your leisure. And lastly, yes, okay, I'll leave the take-home messages up there in closing, and turn it back to you, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I think I speak for everybody when I say that we appreciate your time and that this was a great talk. And just a reminder for everybody listening, if you have any questions about IBAs and KBAs or anything else, you can put those in the chat box. And we do have a few questions ready to go here. So Cheryl asks Andrew, she says, I'm not overly familiar with the structured monitoring in IBAs, but what are the questions associated with the monitoring in IBAs? Also, can you give a sense of how large and how small IBAs are as geographic spaces on the landscape in Canada?
Yes, those are great questions. I'll just start with the second part of that. They really do vary in size. There are some very teeny tiny ones, postage stamp type places, and then there are some enormous sites. These are mainly in northern areas like the Queen Maud Gulf Migratory Bird Sanctuary is also an IBA and will be a KBA. It's enormous. So if you look at the map of Canadian IBAs, you will see this giant polygon right there in Nunavut. And so it really runs the gamut of teeny tiny to quite enormous. The other part of the question, I think, was about the structured monitoring. Yes, so there, I don't know if you're familiar with eBird at all, but this is an important program that we use for monitoring birds in Canada. And we have developed a specific protocol for use in eBird Canada. It's not present in ebird.org. You have to be in ebird.ca to see it. But if you're if you're out birding and you're recording a checklist, you have the option to select the type of count that you did. It could be like a stationary count or a traveling count or something like that. And then another option in there is the IBA Canada protocol. And so the idea is that, and there's a whole document that accompanies that to explain all of it and what you're supposed to do. But it's mainly set up for these large IBAs where it's impossible to get a full count of all the birds just by standing in one place. So you might need teams of people to cover different sectors of the IBA throughout the day, and you collaborate together, just like a Christmas bird count. And then that way, when you enter your checklists at the end of the day and you select this IBA Canada protocol, it allows us to know when we get the data later on that, oh, this was a coordinated count by this group of people, and it's safe to sum up the values of, let's say, canvasbacks for the whole IBA. And we know that you guys collaborated on it, and we know that there should be very little overlap or double counting of birds because you've collaborated that way. And so, as I said, there's a whole, there's a document on the IBA Canada website that is a guide for all of what I just said and explains it much better than I just did. But that's the idea.
Okay, thank you. And Cheryl's giving you the thumbs up.
Okay, yes. Hi, Cheryl.
So Maria asks if you can explain the headings in the IBA table that you had on your slide before the puffins.
I will start sharing again, I guess, and go back to that. Just a second. Whoops. Get to the right one. Yes, the headings. Sure, this is a summary table from one of our IBA sites, and what it's doing is it's rolling up observations that we have for, well, let's just use American widgeon since it's at the top. So American widgeon, you can see there's more than one entry. That's because there's more than one season. We always summarize by season. So we have to know, and this is the same for KBAs, we have to know what population was observed at this place during a particular season. So in this case, you can see fall, winter, spring, summer. And so for American widgeon, we know that at this particular site, over the years of 1988 to 2015 is when we have records, at least, well, we're showing that between 20,000 and 50,000 individual birds were recorded during the fall over that season, during that season. It's not a cumulative number of all the birds, those are individual counts. So, and then over here, we have the IBA criteria that were met. We're doing something slightly different for KBAs, which I haven't showed you, but this just tells which set of criteria. We have different criteria for IBAs than we do for KBAs. This tells us that it's met a global threshold and it's met a continental threshold. Yeah, that's basically it. These cryptic things here are for sorting the table in different ways. You can sort it in taxonomic, you can sort it in alphabetical, you can sort it by importance based on the percentage of the population present. And then these things are little links that go off to helpful places like Wikipedia, Avibase, and Dendroica for getting photos of the bird and songs and maps and other things. You know, am I still coming out through okay? Yeah, there's a bit of interference.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I just wiggled the connection there.
Okay.
Does that
the
answer
next
that
question. I hope so, Maria. Maria, if you have a follow-up, you can put it in the chat box. So the next question is also from Cheryl, and she asks, can you provide some sense of how IBAs could consider criterion C, so that's a KBA criteria for ecological integrity? And she writes, I see this being really relevant in the north, given the remoteness, intactness, etc., but may only be seasonal for birds. And does this matter for the KBA crosswalk?
Yes, really good point and question. For the crosswalk itself, it's it's kind of a separate thing from the crosswalk because the crosswalk is looking at our existing IBAs and which ones could be KBAs, and we don't have any that are based on a biome type ecological integrity criterion. We never did that because we couldn't find a way to make it work, actually. We thought about it quite a lot, but the boreal, for example, you're talking about, it's full of birds, but they're all dispersed. And so you could, you could throw a dart probably at a map of the boreal, and it would probably, no doubt, land on a spot that would qualify as a KBA or as an IBA for containing a certain percentage of all the neotropical migrants or something like that. So it's kind of hard. It's very hard to draw these lines, whether it's for birds or anything really in the boreal, because of it's so homogeneous generally. I think birds could feed into the Criterion C work that is happening. I'm kind of familiar with it a little bit, but not deeply involved so far in what's happening there. But birds could feed into that based on some of the data that we do have from our atlas data, especially. Could be helpful. But yeah, we've been just so overwhelmed with everything else that we really haven't had time to think too deeply about yet another another aspect. But yes, it would be very important to have some of these Criterion C sites in the boreal for sure. We need that. Yeah. I
see that Kira is raising her hand. If Kira, you want to unmute and add anything?
Sure, I'll just add a little bit that there's multiple teams working across the country to identify Criterion C sites, mostly based at academic institutions where they have tools and methods for assessing ecological integrity at the scale of Canada. So it's not really a taxonomic-based criteria. It's very much ecosystem-based, but of course birds are really important. And in fact, there are some projects in the boreal and in Yukon that are considering sort of what are the sets of birds and how are they fitting into the larger issue of ecological integrity. Hopefully we'll have another webinar on that issue at some point soon. But thanks, Andrew. This has been really interesting so far.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Okay. Question from Dan. Will the IBAs that do not meet KBA criteria still be considered IBAs, or will the IBA designation eventually be retired?
Yes, $1 million question. I think, well, there are varying approaches to this around the world so far. Some countries have really embraced the KBA concept and have just gone all in right off the bat, and have stopped talking about IBAs altogether. And then there's other countries where they have not done that at all. And then there's other countries like ours where we've made a start on KBAs. I mean, the IBA information and the website and all of that is kind of a living publication, so it's not going to disappear. But it personally, I can see that over time, and this will take some time, as we socialize the KBA concept within Canada, that eventually we really won't be talking too much about IBAs anymore, and the focus is on KBAs. But it'll take years, not months, before that kind of thing completely happens. But I can see eventually that we won't be, we're not going to maintain two brands indefinitely, for sure.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Cheryl. Can you provide some examples of how Indigenous peoples have been engaged in monitoring in IBAs? She writes, I'm familiar with the efforts in the IBAs along the James Bay in Northern Ontario, but are there other examples and efforts given the focus on monitoring and the scarcity of Northern data sets?
Yeah, another great question. Yes, there's the James Bay one is well known. The other examples I'm aware of are BC coastal sites, Haida Gwaii area. I know that our staff in British Columbia are working closely with Indigenous groups there on invasive species removal, for example, monitoring, site stewarding. There are other BC examples. think of which IBA it was now, Comox, I think, Comox Valley, I believe, where I think they're called the Watchmen, Indigenous, the Watchmen groups are helping to do monitoring of all kinds, not just birds, but fish and water quality and so on, and being stewards of that area. I can think of another example, a few others in Manitoba, where our previous program manager was working at a number of IBAs with Indigenous groups, and they're all within their traditional homelands and eager to help out with things, and quite interested in the concept and being very actively engaged. And I'm trying to think if I know of any others. Those are the ones that come top of mind anyway. Hope that helps.
A question from Remy. How easy is it to modify the boundaries of an IBA/KBA? So for example, when the info about the species occurrence or distribution is updated.
It's very time consuming, I can tell you that. Yeah, and I wouldn't say it's easy, because it's an art, it's not a science. So first of all, birds move, so they move around. So it's kind of, it can be quite challenging to put a hard line around organisms that move, first of all. And then when you get a new information coming in, then you have to decide, okay, well, they're no longer using this area, but they seem to have expanded into this area over here, or there's a new species has showed up. We should maybe move the boundary a little bit up this way to capture this, this ravine or something like that, or and then the situation where we're coming up against with other biodiversity too, not just birds, where the distribution of a plant or some other organism is partially overlapping with an IBA, then you have to think about, well, we need to combine this value with this value and try to come up with some boundary that makes some kind of sense and is defensible in some way. And different people come up with different ideas of what a boundary should look like, and it's kind of a matter of just sitting down and saying, okay, well, that seems reasonable. It ticks all these things, and it seems reasonable, so we'll do it that way. 10 years from now, somebody will come along and say, oh, why did they do it that way? Well, at least we'll have it written down about what our process was, and they can understand it. So there's never any perfect or correct answer, I find, with these things. You just kind of do the best you can. So not easy, and very time consuming, but can be done.
Next question is from Hillary, and Hillary is asking, given the vastness of Canada, can KBAs be identified based on regional importance, i.e. a site that makes a significant contribution to a species population or other KBA criteria at a provincial or territorial level rather than national level? Right.
So far, we haven't gone down that path. Let's say we've discussed it. We haven't gone down the path of looking at stepping down further from global to national to something else. In theory, I guess it's possible, but we would have to discuss the implications of that quite a bit more before we would entertain doing that. I think and Kira may want to jump in on this too.
Yeah, I think you're right, Andrew. I think that it is interesting. It has come up a number of times. I think that there may be good reason to do it at some point, but we have a big chunk right now that we're dealing with, but for both global and national level KBAs. So it would be a next step down there, and certainly if there's interest within provinces and territories to sort of start thinking about that, it's a discussion that we could have.
And Hillary just writes a follow-up that she's thinking about northern regions where concentrations of birds are not as large, may not be sufficient to meet criteria at the national level.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that'd be something
Thanks,
to
Hillary.
put on our on our list for sure.
So there are actually some responses in the chat as well from some folks in BC that are talking about things like boundaries and First Nation involvement. So I encourage everybody to open the chat and look at those if you'd like as well. We have time maybe for one or two more short questions. If anybody has any, you can write them in the chat box. Or you are welcome to unmute yourself if you'd prefer to ask your question verbally as we wrap up. I'll just take this time while we wait to see if any more questions come in to thank everyone again for joining us and reiterate that this recording of this webinar as well as the past webinars will be available online. And we are already in the process of planning our next KBA webinar, which will be in January. And there'll be information about that both in our newsletter, which you can subscribe to on our website if you haven't yet, or on Twitter. Here is one more comment coming in. Just Hillary is making a comment that the Tagish Narrows IBA in Yukon is also a habitat protection area identified by the Carcross/Tagish First Nation for protections as part of their land claims agreement. Okay, it doesn't look like any more questions are coming in. So thank you again, Andrew, for this presentation, and thank you for everybody who has contributed and been involved in this discussion.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been very good.
Yes, we'll see you all again next month. Thank you so much.